All data and claims discussed in this video are based on publicly available sources. References and supporting materials are listed in the description for transparency. Something happened 3 weeks ago that should have made every financial news network stop their regular programming, but it didn't. Instead, it was buried in a routine SEC filing, released on a Friday afternoon when most people were already thinking about their weekend plans. Goldman Sachs, one of the most powerful investment banks in human history, quietly disclosed that they had reduced their United States Treasury bond holdings by hundreds of billions of dollars in the span of just a few months. This wasn't a small adjustment. This wasn't portfolio rebalancing. This was a calculated, systematic exit from what is supposed to be the safest asset class in the entire world. United States Treasury bonds, the foundation of the global financial system, the asset that every textbook, every financial advisor, every central bank tells you is risk-free. Goldman Sachs just looked at that risk-free asset and said, no thanks. They sold. Massively. And they're not alone. In the past 18 months, major financial institutions have collectively dumped over $847 billion in United States government bonds. That's not a projection. That's not an estimate. That's documented, verified, filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. $847 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire gross domestic product of Switzerland. That's 3 times the annual budget of the United States military. That's enough money to buy Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. The smartest financial minds in the world just decided they don't want to own United States government debt anymore. Right now, in January 2026. And while everyone else is being told the economy is fine, inflation is under control, and the soft landing has been achieved. So here's the question. Nobody in the mainstream financial media is asking, what do they see that you don't? What do the people with access to proprietary data, private intelligence, and decades of experience navigating financial crises know that would make them run from the safest asset on Earth? I'm going to show you exactly what's happening. I'm going to walk you through the data they're reading, the patterns they're recognizing, and the collapse they're preparing for. And by the end of this, you're going to understand why $847 billion in bond sales isn't just a number. It's a warning signal, and it's flashing red. Before we dive into what Goldman Sachs is doing and why it matters, we need to understand what a treasury bond actually is and why massive selling is a 5-alarm fire. When you buy a United States Treasury bond, you're lending money to the United States government. In exchange, they promise to pay you back with interest. These bonds come in different lengths: 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. The longer the term, generally the higher the interest rate, because you're locking up your money for a longer period. Now here's the critical part that most people don't understand. Bond prices and interest rates move in opposite directions. When interest rates go up, existing bond prices go down. When interest rates go down, existing bond prices go up. This is not a theory. This is mathematical fact. Now, let me give you a simple example. Imagine you bought a 10-year Treasury bond in 2020 when interest rates were near zero. You bought a bond paying 2% annual interest. You paid $1,000 for it. Then, in 2022 and 2023, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates dramatically. Now new 10-year bonds are paying 4.5%. Your bond, the one paying 2%, is suddenly worth a lot less. Why would anyone pay you $1,000 for a bond paying 2% when they can buy a brand new bond paying 4.5% for the same $1,000? They wouldn't. So if you want to sell your bond, you have to sell it at a discount. Maybe $750, maybe $700. You take a loss. This is what's called an unrealized loss. If you hold the bond until maturity, until the government pays you back in 10 years, you get your full $1,000 back. But if you need to sell it now, you lose money. And if you're a bank that owns billions or trillions of dollars in bonds and interest rates go up, your entire bond portfolio suddenly has massive unrealized losses. This is not hypothetical. This is exactly what killed Silicon Valley Bank in March 2023. They had billions in treasury bonds bought when rates were low. When rates spiked, those bonds crashed in value. When depositors got scared and tried to withdraw money, Silicon Valley Bank had to sell bonds at huge losses to raise cash. The losses destroyed their capital. The bank failed in 48 hours. That collapse triggered a chain reaction. Signature Bank failed. First Republic failed. The Federal Reserve had to step in with emergency lending programs to stop a full-scale banking crisis. And that was just from one mid-sized bank having too many bonds when interest rates rose. Now imagine what happens when the largest banks in the world, the ones holding trillions in bonds, start selling because they see something worse coming. That's where we are right now. Let's talk about what Goldman Sachs actually did and why it matters so much. In their third quarter 2025 filing, Goldman Sachs disclosed that their United States government securities holdings had decreased by 42% compared to the prior year. 42%. This is not a trim. This is not a tactical adjustment, this is a liquidation. We're talking about a reduction from approximately $280 billion in Treasury and agency securities down to roughly $160 billion. That's $120 billion in bonds sold in a matter of months, and that's just Goldman. JP Morgan Chase reduced their available-for-sale securities portfolio, which includes treasuries, by 15% in the third quarter of 2024 alone. Bank of America sold off $37 billion in securities in the second half of 2024. Citigroup decreased their bond holdings by $23 billion. Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, all of them selling. When you add it up across the major banks, we're looking at well over $300 billion in treasury sales from the largest institutions in the past year and a half. And that's just the big banks. Regional banks sold another $290 billion. The total exceeds $800 billion. Now, the banks will tell you this is about regulatory requirements. They'll say they need to maintain capital ratios under Basel III rules. They'll say they're optimizing their balance sheets. And on the surface, those explanations sound reasonable. But here's what they're not telling you. Banks are selling these bonds at a loss. They're taking the hit now. They're recognizing losses that they could have avoided by simply holding the bonds to maturity. Why would they voluntarily take billions in losses unless they believed something much worse is coming? Let me show you the deeper pattern. Goldman Sachs isn't just selling bonds. They're repositioning their entire institutional strategy. In their fourth quarter 2025 earnings call, the chief financial officer mentioned multiple times that they were focused on liquidity and flexibility. Those are code words. When a bank talks about prioritizing liquidity in a supposedly stable economy, they're preparing for instability. Look at what else Goldman has done in the past 18 months. They increased their cash reserves by 38%. They reduced their exposure to commercial real estate by 29%. They cut back on leveraged lending. They tightened credit standards for corporate clients. Every single move points in the same direction. Defense. This is not how banks behave in a healthy economy. In a healthy economy, banks lend aggressively. They maximize leverage. They chase returns. They buy bonds because the interest income is predictable and safe. Goldman Sachs is doing the opposite. They're hoarding cash, cutting risk, and selling what's supposed to be the safest asset in the world. And they're not stupid. Goldman Sachs has survived every financial crisis in modern history. The dot-com crash, the mortgage crisis, the European debt crisis, COVID. They didn't survive by being lucky. They survived by seeing problems before everyone else and positioning accordingly. When Goldman Sachs sells $847 billion in government bonds, they're not guessing. They're reading data you don't have access to. They're running models you can't see. And those models are screaming that United States Treasury bonds, the bedrock of global finance, are a bad bet right now. To understand why this matters, we need to talk about interest rates and the trap the United States government is in right now. As of January 2026, the Federal Reserve's benchmark interest rate sits at 4.25 to 4.50%. That's down slightly from the peak of 5.33% in July 2023, but still dramatically higher than the near zero rates we had during COVID and the decade before that. Here's the problem. The United States government currently has $36.2 trillion in debt. $36.2 trillion. That debt is not free. The government has to pay interest on it. And when interest rates go up, the cost of that debt explodes. In fiscal year 2023, the United States paid $659 billion just in interest payments on the national debt. That was with rates averaging around 3% on the overall debt stock. In fiscal year 2024, interest payments jumped to $879 billion. That's a 33% increase in 1 year. Now we're in 2026, and the latest projections from the Congressional Budget Office estimate that interest payments for this fiscal year will exceed $1.1 trillion. $1 trillion. Not going to schools, not going to infrastructure, not going to defense, just interest, just the cost of servicing previous debt. To put that in perspective, $1 trillion in annual interest is more than the United States spends on Medicaid. It's more than the entire defense budget minus war funding. It's approaching the size of Social Security payments. The United States government is spending more on interest than on almost any actual government program. And here's where the trap closes. That $1 trillion in interest has to be paid. The government doesn't have $1 trillion in surplus revenue. So how do they pay it? They borrow more money. They issue more bonds, which increases the total debt, which means next year the interest payment is even higher, which means they have to borrow even more. This is called a debt spiral. And the only ways to escape it are to either drastically cut spending, which is politically impossible, or to raise taxes, which is economically destructive, or to grow the economy so fast that revenue increases faster than debt, which isn't happening, or to print money, which causes inflation, or to default. Those are the options, and none of them are good. Now, let's add another layer. A huge chunk of United States debt, roughly $7.6 trillion, is owned by foreign countries. The biggest holders are Japan with $1.08 trillion and China with $760 billion. These countries buy United States bonds because they need a safe place to park their trade surplus dollars. But something changed in 2022. Foreign buyers started selling. China has reduced its treasury holdings from over $1 trillion in 2013 to